The Sycamore Institute is an independent public policy research center focused on state and local issues in Tennessee. We're a think tank, and what sets us apart from most organizations in the policy space is that we don't advocate or lobby or take positions. Our role is to provide impartial insights and analysis and context and explanation on things ranging from public finance and the state budget to health and criminal justice and housing and all sorts of things. We're happy to have you all with us here this morning to learn about the governor's proposal. Before we get going, I just want to ask if you could, each of you, just drop your name in the chat along with your organization and kind of your general location, what part of the state you're joining us from, because we always love to see that information. So thank you all again, and I will hand it off to Mandy Spears.
Hi, everybody. I am Mandy Spears, and I am the Executive Vice President here at the Sycamore Institute, and I'm going to be walking you through our budget summary today alongside Robin Ye, who is our Policy Director. And because we have a lot of ground to cover, I'm just going to jump right in. Can I get a thumbs up from staff that you see my slide deck? Great, wonderful. Okay, so what we're here to talk about today is about 4 weeks ago, Governor Lee delivered his State of the State address for 2026, and with it, he introduced his recommended budget for 2027. So I'm here to walk through that request, how much is in it, where is the money coming from and going, and what that also might mean for future years. But first, I always like to just do a little bit of review of some budget basics to make sure we're all on the same page with our understanding of things as we use some jargon as we go through this. So the first thing to know is we do have a balanced budget requirement in our state constitution, and it states that expenditures for any fiscal year shall not exceed the state's revenues and reserves for that year. So in other words, the state can't spend any more in a given year than it brings in or it has on hand that year. And so that means that the budget is full of trade-offs. Have to keep revenues in balance with expenditures. Every dollar spent on one thing is a dollar that can't be spent somewhere else or given back to the taxpayer. So just lots of trade-offs in the budget process. Another important concept is the difference between recurring and non-recurring. So recurring items are expected to happen again and again, and non-recurring are one time. And both expenditures and revenues receive these categorizations, and it is one tool that helps keep the budget balanced over time. So if you have some new expense, for example, that you know you're going to fund every year, that's recurring. And to keep the budget balanced over the longer term, it needs to be paid for with some new recurring revenue source or a cut in revenue in recurring spending. Most of the budget is recurring. Non-recurring expenses are often things like road projects, buildings, pilot programs. And then non-recurring revenues are things that we're expected to just get one time. And usually those are surpluses, so money that's left over at the end of a fiscal year. Another important concept is the recurring base budget, and that's all the stuff in the general fund that is expected to happen year after year. And this is our starting point for each year's budget. So when the executive branch begins planning for the next year's budget, they begin with all those recurring items, and they either add to them or they take away from them. So the things that usually get the most scrutiny tend to be recurring increases. And this includes inflationary increases. And I'll note that nothing grows automatically per se in our budget. So even inflationary increases will show up as recurring increases. So our school funding formula and TennCare, those are great examples of things that need to grow every year because of inflation, because of changes in enrollment. And this means that it also means that only a small portion of the budget has much flexibility in terms of scaling up and down. If you have all these things that you have to spend your money on year after year. The other thing that gets a lot of scrutiny are non-recurring items. And again, these are the one-time items. By nature, they are one-time, maybe a capital project, a deposit to the rainy day fund, or some time-limited activity, or sometimes they're just like one-time activities that are like earmarks, for example, a grant to a nonprofit organization. Another important part of the budget process is the revenue estimation process. So when you are operating in a balanced budget environment, all the decisions about spending are done within these limits of some estimate of how much revenue there will be. That happens in December and it feeds into the budget. And it is the reason why I'm going to talk a little bit about revenues when I summarize this budget, is because it tells us something about the current budget, but it also tells us something about future budgets as well. And then the last basic thing to know is that even though we call it the 2027 recommendation, it really deals with 3 fiscal years at once. There's the recommendation for fiscal year 2027, which is next fiscal year, but the budget always includes changes to the current fiscal year, which is 2026. Usually there's a revenue reestimate based on new information about how revenues are coming in. There's actually not a reestimate this time because things are pretty much on track. And then there's always some spending changes, which are known as supplemental spending. And then 2027 and 2026 changes reflect the impact of end of year items from 2025, last fiscal year. So, namely, in recent years, there have been some large surpluses that are available to spend. So, I'm going to be using all 3 years as we go through this presentation. And then finally, one other constitutional provision, any law requiring the expenditure of funds shall be null and void unless during the session in which the act receives final passage, an appropriation is made for the estimated first year's funding. In other words, if a bill costs money and it's not funded in the budget and the legislature accidentally passes it for some reason, it is voided. It becomes null and void. So this is why fiscal notes are really important. If it's not in the governor's recommendation and it costs a lot of money, it can be difficult to get it passed and funded. So now that the basics are out of the way, we're going to move on to what is in the 2027 recommendation. So some of the big themes here are, one, it includes a large overall decrease, and that is largely coming from the end of COVID era dollars. We also see that state spending, so spending just from the state's own revenues, is relatively flat, with very few big new investments. It also reflects a growing reliance on the general fund to address the highway fund structural deficit. And then finally, many of the revenues and budget practices are returning to a post-pandemic normal. And I'm going to walk through all of these things, but those are kind of the themes behind the stuff that Robin and I are going to explain to you. So first, top line numbers. On the left-hand side, from all sources, we're looking at a $57.9 billion budget. That's 6.1 billion lower than the estimate for the current year, or about 9.5% lower. So a pretty big drop. But if you're looking at just the state dollars on the right-hand side, it's 29.7 billion. That's about 106 million less, or less than a 1% drop from the current fiscal year. So again, pretty flat. So we're going to focus more on this state piece, and I will come back to the federal stuff a little bit later. But so here are the increments. I talked about how we really focus on the increments in the budget process. So this is showing where the money comes from on the left-hand side and where the money goes on the right-hand side. This budget has about 2.9 billion in changes. So those are increases or decreases to that recurring base budget that we talked about. And this includes changes to both 2026 and 2027, although the 2026 changes are pretty minor in the grand scheme of things. We've got a balanced budget, so you see 2.9 billion on both sides. And we're going to use each of these graphics to give you context for specific things that we're going to talk about, so you get kind of an idea of the scale of what we're talking about. So we're going to focus on the left side first, where the money comes from. And this is the exact same information. It's just a little bit bigger and it's rotated. But it breaks down to about 1.1 billion in recurring changes and 1.8 billion in non-recurring. So let's zoom in on some takeaways behind all of this. So first, pandemic era windfalls and budget practices are winding down, and state tax revenues are normalizing. So I'd say that this budget reflects some normalizing in, like, overall from a revenue perspective. And we see things kind of trying to settle back into this post-pandemic normal. So the first part of that is, although the state had another big surplus at the end of fiscal year 2025, it was the smallest in 5 years. So let's break that down a little bit. It's this biggest chunk on the non-recurring side. So this is money that was left unspent at the end of fiscal year 2025, 1.1 billion in total. Now that is a big surplus, but here it is in context. We have had some really large surpluses in recent years. You see one that was 2.4 billion in 2022. So this one's no different, historically large, but it is the smallest one in 5 years. So that suggests that maybe our surpluses are tapering down. What else suggests it is where those surpluses are coming from. So this shows where that money comes from in each of those years. So first we have kind of our traditional sources that most people think of when they think of a surplus, and that is the state collecting more than they anticipated. You see, there was one year there where we actually collected less than anticipated, but usually a surplus comes from over collections. We also have other sources of revenue here that I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute that are sort of non-tax sources. Then we have reversions. And reversions are when agencies send unspent money back to the general fund at the end of the year. So they are reverting those dollars to the general fund. And then the last category is reserve transfers, which I'm not going to talk much about. But a couple of things to note about these recent surpluses. You see how big those program reversions were. That's the pink area there. Some level of reversion is planned every year, but these are over and above those planned reversions. And a lot of that came from federal COVID dollars replacing state dollars, particularly for 10 care. So we would kind of budget normally, but we ended up having federal dollars to cover those state expenses. So the state dollars reverted back to the general fund. And most of the source of that is coming to an end or has already ended. The other thing is that a big part of the light blue blocks that you see in the last few years, those other revenue category, has been from the treasurer's investment of funds. And the reason those have been so large is that we have been sitting on a lot of cash from the federal government. So we got those COVID dollars up front, but we had several years to spend them. So in the meantime, we could invest that cash and make money off of that investment as a state. And that's something policymakers didn't necessarily budget for. So that's a big part of that. And those two are going to be going away over the next several years. In the meantime, you see that we have those earnings showing up in the surplus for fiscal year 2025, but they're also a big chunk of non-recurring revenue in the current fiscal year also, almost $500 million. So extra treasurer earnings are in that surplus, and now in the midst of the current fiscal year, we are seeing we're going to get more from those earnings than they'd previously budgeted out of those. And again, those are sources that are kind of tapering off and will be going away. The next thing to know is that the budget ends the practice of using recurring dollars for non-recurring purposes. This was another COVID era practice that policymakers used to kind of deal with a lot of economic uncertainty. Back to where all the money came from. So what we're talking about right now is this chunk here, almost $500 million. So those were recurring revenues that were in the last budget that policymakers used for non-recurring items. So in other words, these funds weren't tied up for long-term commitments. They got spent in a one-time way for fiscal year 2026, and then they were unallocated for the fiscal year 2027 budget. So this is something that state lawmakers have been doing for several years because there was fear that the really strong tax growth that we were getting during the pandemic was going to slow down or maybe even decline. And here's what that's looked like. So back in 2024, they used 2.6 billion in recurring revenue for one-time things, and that meant that 2.6 billion was still available to allocate to things in the next budget cycle. And you see that this budget is bringing that practice to an end, leaving only 7 million unallocated, and that's in line with pre-pandemic budget. So there won't be a lot of free dollars already in the base the next time the budget gets put together for fiscal year 2028. And then kind of the final big piece is state tax collections look like they might be settling into their new normal, and that does reflect a greater reliance on the sales tax in Tennessee. So back here, we're looking at the second biggest piece on the recurring side of the recurring revenues, and that's about 450 million in revenue growth in 2027. That 450 million comes from an assumed 2.2% growth in state tax revenues. A lot of people are calling this tight. So let's put that in context. So we're going to zoom out, going all the way back to 2017, so about 10 years here. And there was a lot going on behind the scenes here. So first of all, these years of low and no growth reflect the impact of cuts that were made to the franchise and excise taxes during those years. Those are our corporate taxes in Tennessee. And then this really rapid growth during the pandemic represents a couple of things. One, really strong pandemic era consumer spending and the effects of some changes that the state made to sales tax collections during this time that expanded the types of internet sales that the sales tax applied to. So, a couple of things going on that contributed to these double-digit years of revenue growth. So this growth, yes, it is modest, 2.2%, but it looks a lot more like what it did before the pandemic. So things might be sort of normalizing, getting back to a new normal in terms of revenue growth for our budget. Another thing that these changes did was it changed our dependency on the sales tax. So when we look at all funds in the state budget for fiscal year 2017 and then the recommendation for 2017, we see that 61% of all state taxes were coming from the sales tax in 2017, and that's expected to grow to 67% by 2027, and all the other categories dropped. Now, if you just look at the funds in the general fund, the same thing, growing reliance on sales tax from 69% to 73%. So this is important because every tax comes with its own characteristics and trade-offs. You know, who pays the tax, how it affects the money those taxpayers have for other things, what that means for well-being, what it means for the overall economy. And then there's also implications for how reliable and volatile these taxes are. So I won't go into all of that, but I will just note that that dependency is sort of shifting as all these changes go into effect. So moving on to the spending side of things. So now we're looking at kind of where the money goes side of things. And the two big chunks are new spending in 2027. So we have about $1 billion of new recurring spending, and we have about 1.7 billion in non-recurring spending and like one-time deposits. So the first thing to note is over half of new recurring spending is just to cover those routine cost increases that I talked about earlier. In fact, this is what it looks like. Out of all that new recurring spending, about 590 million of it or more is just on these routine cost increases. So examples include TennCare cost increases and federal match changes, increases in the K through 12 funding formula, which Robin is going to talk more about in a minute, state employee salary and health benefit cost increases, higher education formula adjustments, prison contract costs. So, in other words, much of what looks like new money in the budget is actually just the cost of maintaining existing services. I like to call it just the cost of doing business. So, a lot of that, you know, that's even more than the 450 million they're projecting we're getting in new revenue just from these routine cost increases. So now I'll hand it to Robin to cover some K through 12 stuff.
All right, thanks, Mandy. Hi, everybody. My name is Robin Ye. I'm policy director at Sycamore, and I'm going to dive a bit more into the K-12 portion of the FY27 budget. So, in the FY27 budget, it includes 7.9 billion for K-12 education, and this encompasses TISA, as Mandy mentioned, but also other K-12 programs such as Education Freedom Scholarship. So, we'll dive a bit more into each of these components in this section. So there is 7.1 billion total for the TISA public school funding formula within the K-12 education budget. And like in previous years, there is 125 million restricted within the base of TISA, and that includes both state and local share for teacher pay. So if you're just looking at the state portion, which is roughly a 70% share, then it's around $88 million for teacher pay. And so looking a little bit more about average public school teacher salaries from the past 10 years, this chart shows both the unadjusted increase in teacher salaries, which is a dotted line, and the blue bars show that amount adjusted for inflation. So as you can see, over the past 10 years, the actual teacher salaries, the unadjusted numbers, has increased over the years slightly, although that unadjusted number has decreased from 64,000 in 2015 to 59,000 in 2024. So generally, big takeaway here is that teacher salaries have not kept up with inflation over the past 10 years. But the thing is that this is actually a trend across a lot of Southeast states. So Tennessee is not unusual in this place. We are number 4 behind Georgia, Virginia, Alabama in terms of our adjusted teacher salary. But then again, we are pretty close with Arkansas and Kentucky and North Carolina in terms of that decrease when adjusted for inflation over the past 10 years. So you can see here, these are just the adjusted change from 2015 to 2024. And for Tennessee, it was an 8% decrease when you adjust for inflation for the average teacher salary. Diving a little bit more into the TISA funding formula. So in addition to the 7.1 billion for TISA school funding, that also includes an increase to the base per pupil amount for TISA. So currently the base per pupil amount for this school year 2025-2026 is 7,295 per student, and then those students can also generate additional weights depending on their characteristics. In FY27, the proposed base amount is 7,530, and so that total is roughly around $82 million, and that encompasses enrollment growth and health insurance premiums and retirement contributions that is within that base of TISA. There's also 40 million for fast growth and the infrastructure fund. And so this portion of TISA is for a grant for school districts that meet the definition of fast growth. And so that is provided and based off of their enrollment throughout that school year. And we did also want to note that there is 80 million still in the FY 2026 base that did not go out to school districts. The Tennessee Department of Education and FNA had testified that they often include 80 million in the base when projecting those numbers because TISA enrollment numbers are not finalized in the time that they are developing the budget. And so there's often leftover funds there that do not go out to school districts due to lower than projected enrollment. So we want to kind of put this in context in terms of what it looks like from the past 30 years. So as you all know, the state implemented a new school funding formula a few years ago, which is TISA, and before that we had the BEP. So this chart shows the both increase in school funding over the past 30 years, and then also the annual unadjusted change in that funding from year to year. So the pink bars show the annual unadjusted change in the state money put into public school funding formula. The blue bubble line shows that actual increase from year to year of the amount that was put into the funding formula, and then the blue dotted line above that shows that adjusted for inflation. So maybe if you click to the next. So you'll see that there is a dip around 2022, 2023, and that is because of higher inflation during that year. But you also see that in 2023, when the state implemented TISA, that there was a huge increase in school funding in the funding formula. And then you'll also see too this red dotted line that just appeared on the screen that shows the current so in FY27 the current increase in the funding formula compared to the previous year, and you can see that is lower than in past years, although it has changed from year to year, and there were times when there was a large increase in the funding formula in terms of state funds put in, and other years in which there were lower increases than typical. So diving a little bit more into the Education Freedom Scholarships, we know that this is a program that is obviously gotten a lot of attention over the past couple years. So I want to note first that Education Freedom Scholarships, the funds for this are separate than the funds from TISA. So there are 304 million in the budget for up to 440,000 scholarships, which doubles the amount of existing scholarships for EFS. And this 304 million encompasses the existing 20,000 scholarships that are currently being awarded to students. And it also encompasses an additional 5,000 new scholarships. So the EFS law builds in an increase to the number of scholarships based off of subject to appropriations, of course. If there is if there are 75% of, let me get this right. If there are if 75% of people apply, sorry, I'm messing this up, but if Danny, can you help me out here in terms of that increase?
Oh, yes. I
Okay.
think as long as basically if there's just enough interest in the applications, then it is set to automatically grow by 5,000 as long as the money's appropriated for
Yes, that's right. It's
it.
just getting too complicated there. And then
Yeah.
there is also that also includes 15,000 new scholarships, and that is dependent on legislation passed by the Tennessee General Assembly to increase that cap amount. Also wanted to note too that even though EFS is the funding does not come from TISA, the amount of the scholarship is based on the TISA per pupil base. So the proposed scholarship amount for FY27 would be that 7,530. There are also half of scholarships are restricted for families that meet a certain income threshold. So that would be roughly around 173,000 for a family of four, based off that threshold. Last thing I wanted to note too is that there is a enrollment loss hold harmless that starts in the 26-27 school year. So districts are held to their prior TISA allocation, and they will not have a decrease in allocation, but only if that district experiences both an enrollment loss and a decline in their total TISA calculation for that school year. So we want to put this a bit in context with some other school choice programs and state funding that Tennessee has. So as you can see here, in FY26, which is the current fiscal year and the current school year, there are 20,000 education freedom scholarships, and each scholarship amount is 7,295, which is the same as the TISA base amount, per pupil base amount. With Education Savings Account, which is another school choice program that the state has, the requirements for this program are different than EFS, and the funding amount is also different, but that amount is more than EFS, so it's roughly $9,788. And to put that in context with the TISA state funding portion per pupil for students in public schools, that is $7,023, and so that encompasses that state portion that is a per pupil amount, but it ranges widely across school districts. So every school district has a different state and local share based off their fiscal capacity. So some districts are receiving state funds as low as $3,500 per pupil in terms of state dollars, and then some are around 10,000 in terms of that state portion that they receive per pupil. And another thing to put in context as well is the how this looks like in context of the entire budget for the Tennessee Department of Education. So as you can see, TISA encompasses 90% of that $7.9 billion budget, and EFS is roughly around to 2 to 4%. And if that scholarship amount increases, or the scholarship seats increase, and it's a little bit more, but overall, TISA is a majority of the department's budget for education.
Thanks, Robin. So another key takeaway about what's happening on the spending side of things is the budget includes a total of $425 million in both recurring and non-recurring general fund subsidies for the highway fund. So what's going on here is primarily dedicated highway fund revenues aren't keeping up with inflation. So we have gas taxes, fuel taxes, car registration fees. These have all traditionally been used to pay for road construction and maintenance because they acted roughly as user fees. You know, the more you drive, the more you contribute to the highway fund. But that linkage has really broken down for a number of reasons. You know, we have electric vehicles, hybrids, how the taxes themselves are structured. But another is the cost to construct roads has grown a lot faster than even general inflation, which has also been very high. So here's what those collections have looked like over the last decade. So relatively flat, even in nominal terms. Now adjusting them for road construction inflation, and you see that they actually dropped in value by 37% in just like a handful of years. So this is what we call a structural deficit. A structural deficit happens when ongoing expenses are higher than the ongoing revenues used to pay for it. And so, what have we been doing as a state? We have been subsidizing the highway fund with the general fund. So, this budget includes a one-time $400 million transfer and then a recurring $25 million transfer that would happen every year. And this follows several other general fund subsidies in recent years. So, we had a $1 billion non-recurring transfer in the current year's budget. 3.3 billion in fiscal year 2024. That was part of the Transportation Modernization Act. And then last year, lawmakers also approved diverting sales tax from the sale of tires from the general fund to the highway fund, which they estimated to be about $96 million a year. That would no longer go to the general fund, but would go to the highway fund. So this is sort of a growing problem that the state is putting band-aids on. I would say that Tennessee is absolutely not the only state in this position. And in fact, the Federal Highway Fund is also in the same position. But so far, we've kind of tried to address it with non-recurring, one-time transfers from the general fund, and then a few sort of attempts at doing some recurring patches as well. I will say this is not the only structural deficit in this budget. So the budget also reflects a structural deficit for lottery funded scholarships. So there's really three main reasons for that I'm going to walk through with charts. The first is that the proceeds we are getting from the state lottery, they've dropped. The second is scholarship costs, the things that we fund with those lottery proceeds have increased. And then some supplemental sports betting revenues that were intended to supplement those lottery proceeds are going to be diverted from the lottery funded scholarships. And I'm going to walk through this kind of step by step, looking at the last 7 years of actuals and then looking forward to the next 5 years of projections. So first of all, this is net lottery proceeds. And what you see is declines in recent years. And then the most conservative estimates show flat funding over the next 5 years. And the reasons here are a little unclear, but some theories include competition from sports betting, which is new in Tennessee, fewer big jackpots, so fewer people playing, and then just broader kind of economic conditions that may be keeping people from playing the lottery. Now we're seeing the costs and projections of the scholarships that get funded from those dollars, and you see those costs continuing to grow. What's underlying that? This shows the cost for those different scholarships that get funded from the lottery over the last 7 years. And a lot of that growth you see is coming from increases in the Hope Scholarship and increases in dual enrollment grants. So back to our projections, you see that we have a deficit starting here in the last fiscal year 2025. I will say the lottery funds do have a reserve that they can rely on when this happens. However, I will say sports betting became legal in Tennessee in 2020. The taxes from those began supplementing lottery proceeds beginning in 2021. So this higher line is those revenues combined. However, last year in the Education Freedom Scholarship Act, policymakers voted to redirect sports betting funds to a new K through 12 school construction fund. But it did stipulate that if the dollars were needed to cover scholarship costs, then they'd go there first, and then only the excess would go to the construction fund. So you see them being used here in the current fiscal year in the budget's projections. But what you also see in the budget is the budget assumes that those are no longer going to be used for lottery funded scholarships beginning next year. So, how does that work with the language in that bill? Well, the budget also assumes some other action is taken to manage those scholarship costs to keep them funded with lottery proceeds alone. So, it displays an unallocated, quote, expenditure reduction in the budget to make that math work without relying on those sports betting dollars. So, this means that if the lottery proceeds continue to be sluggish, like these really conservative estimates show, some action is going to have to be taken to either supplement those dollars with money from somewhere else or to reduce scholarship costs. So what does that mean for that school construction fund? It means that they are making that fund whole by supplementing available dollars from the general fund. So again, the general fund is sort of supporting a structural deficit in another fund, at least for a couple of years. So you see the total amounts for that school construction fund there, and you see that $11 million is proposed in the current fiscal year from the general fund and 20 million for next fiscal year to supplement those dollars as they're still being used for lottery funded scholarships. On the spending side, another highlight is that the budget is allocating a fourth year of TennCare shared savings. So shared savings represent federal dollars that the state receives for meeting TennCare spending limits that are set by the federal government. So over the last 4 years, Tennessee's received a total of $1.3 billion from shared savings. And these are a non-recurring source of funding because we don't know if and how much TennCare will meet those targets each year. So we don't want to assume we're going to get, $200 million a year if we don't end up getting those dollars. So if you kind of just note the colors in your head here. Here's how that translates to the way that they're allocated. So the pink is what they're allocating in the current budget. So they've taken those dollars and they've applied them to sort of time limited activities that run through fiscal year 2031. So you see we have activities going all the way through 2031 that are funded with that very first year's shared savings, which is the maroon on the bottom. So I'll note that some of these activities also trigger the Medicaid federal match. So when we spend money on some of these items, we're drawing down additional federal dollars at the same time. Some of the bigger allocations coming from shared savings are listed here. That first one, Strong Tennessee Families, that's several coverage expansions for low-income parents, for example. Two of the biggest are new things this year. One is called a Pathways to Independence. It's a 4-year pilot to address the TennCare benefit cliff. So it is the proposal there is to provide up to 12 months of premium assistance to help parents who are enrolled in the program afford private coverage. And they're expected to serve about 15,000 caregivers per year with that. The other big one this year is for Rural Health Transformation Resiliency Grants, and those are to supplement a federal rural healthcare transformation program, basically to pay for dollars that the federal dollars can't be paid for. Again, I'll note that all of these are non-recurring except that first one, the Strong Tennessee Families, which does have money in the base budget to continue that when these shared savings dollars expire. So I will also say the budget includes 3 million recurring and 8 million non-recurring for the General Assembly to allocate in the budget. So the governor presents a budget that's balanced, and the recommendation generally spends just about every penny available and leaves a placeholder for the legislature to spend on their priorities. So, for context, a $59 billion budget with a 3 million, an $11 million placeholder for the legislature. So that means there's really not a lot of room for the legislature to do its own thing without changing some of these recommended priorities that the governor has asked for. So now just a little bit about federal funding. So the budget largely reflects baseline assumptions about federal funding and may not fully capture very recent or uncertain shifts. So I think sometimes people open the budget document wondering how it's going to deal with all the uncertainty going on at the federal level. And for the most part, it doesn't. It reflects the things that, they absolutely knew when they were putting together the budget document and does not try to project what the federal government may do. So what you see here in the budget is the federal funds are dropping pretty significantly from 26 to 27. Those are the maroon bars. There was a ramp up there that began in 2020. Those are all those federal COVID related dollars that went out to states, and they're still showing up in 2026. So states had until the end of the calendar year 2024 to obligate those dollars, but we actually have until the end of this calendar year, which is into fiscal year 2027, to spend those dollars. So those dollars are still on the books. So even though there's a big drop from 2026 to 2027, in the end, the 2026 amount will probably be more spread out over those 2 years. But you do see those dollars going away and nothing really replacing them. And so with those dollars coming to an end, you also see the bubbles there. That shows the percent of our budget coming from federal dollars. And you see the federal funding reaching a smaller share of our total budget really in over a decade. So the dependency on federal dollars is really coming down there. There are some federal cuts that are reflected in the budget beyond just those COVID era dollars coming to an end. One, it reflects a cut in federal funding for the administration of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. And those are costs that the state is going to have to pick up now. This year's budget reflects $60 million. That's just a partial year cost because the state and federal fiscal years don't perfectly align up. And that cost will probably be more like 77 million next year. It does not reflect a reduction. It does not reflect kind of a change in cost sharing for benefits that will go into effect in fiscal year 2028, depending on the state's payment error rate. This is something we talk a lot about in a paper we recently published on SNAP, but those are additional costs that may be coming to the state in the next fiscal year. We also see in the budget a reduction from a formula recalculation that resulted in fewer federal dollars for childcare. And then we have two pots of money that were rescinded before they were set to end by the federal administration. And that included some COVID dollars for education and a solar energy program out of the U.S. Department of Energy called Solar for All. An example of something not reflected in the budget is the Rural Health Transformation Program. So Tennessee received notification in December from the federal government that we are eligible for about $207 million per year for 5 years, beginning in the current fiscal year. Just based on the timing of when the budget gets put together, that is not reflected in the budget document, but will eventually show up and will probably be reflected in the administration amendment that comes from the administration in a few weeks. Finally, we always like to give you an update on the rainy day fund. So the budget continues to stock money away for a rainy day with a $20 million deposit in fiscal year 2027. So this shows the balance in our rainy day fund over time. This deposit would bring the balance up to $2.21 billion. This line gives you an idea of the spending power of those dollars over time, expressed as days of general fund operations. So if all our revenues just disappeared tomorrow, how far could we get with that balance based on the size of the budget? And it represents about 31 days in the 2027 budget. So we continue to maintain a healthier position than we had going into the Great Recession all the way back in 2008. I do also just want to remind you that Tennessee's rainy day fund can't just be used for any storm. I'm showing the statutory language here for our rainy day fund, and it is specifically for shortfalls in state revenues or when there is a need to spend more money than was appropriated. So it's not necessarily for shortfalls of federal funds. And then in the second section there, you see that the intent is that spending gets cut first. And traditionally, the state has not only gone that route, so cutting spending first, but also tapped into other program reserves before looking to the rainy day fund. And then I'll say if that we did need to tap the rainy day fund for some reason, some things need to happen in order for that to be possible. First, if it is a collection shortfall, The administration can tap into it, but they do have to notify the legislature and there has to be, a legislative hearing on it. And then if it's an expenditure overage, that requires a new Appropriations Act from the General Assembly. So they would have to pass a separate piece of legislation that made that possible. So as we kind of come to an end here, what's next? Back to our budget cycle. We are here fully in the legislative review part of the process. Committees have been holding their budget hearings over the last several weeks. And as the process wraps up, we'll see both legislative amendments to the budget, so spending that, $11 million placeholder, but also potentially making changes to the things that the governor has recommended. And then we'll have a final administration amendment from the governor that will maybe tweak his proposal based on any new information or legislative action. And then finally, I always like to plug our Tennessee State Budget Primer if you're interested in kind of a bigger picture of the state budget and the state budget process that explains nearly everything you need to know about how that process works. And I'm going to kick it back to Brian for a few little announcements.
Yeah, thank you, Mandy, and thanks everybody for joining us for this. Just a couple things I wanted to shout out to you. One is sort of a shameless plug for us, for Sycamore. If this was helpful to you, if you appreciate the fact that we provide this kind of information for free, we would be so grateful if you would support Sycamore Institute with a donation. My colleague is putting a link in the chat. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and philanthropy and donations are really what fuel our ability to provide information like this for free of charge to the folks across the state. Also wanted to say that we have a couple of events coming up in the next few weeks and months in Johnson City and in Cookeville next week. So Johnson City on next Tuesday and Cookeville next Thursday. We are hosting housing policy summits. These are going to be lunchtime events. Just to sort of drive some more informed and productive conversations around housing issues at the local and regional level there. And so we would love for y'all to join us there if you're in the neighborhood and interested. And then also, go ahead and mark your calendars for May 13th. Here in Nashville, we will be hosting our annual forum, which is an event that we always love doing every year. It's a great time to sort of step back from single policy issues and talk about things that really drive everything that we're working with. And this year, the topic is about how information shapes public life and the evolving news and, algorithms and all those kinds of things. And so we hope that y'all consider joining us for that on May 13th. Once again, really looking forward to all those events and appreciate you guys spending some time here with us this morning. If you have any questions about anything, follow up that we didn't get to, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We always love to hear from people. Thanks so much.